Good afternoon, it's Friday the 8th of December 2017, just after 1 o'clock. Welcome to UK Column News. I'm your host Brian Gerrish, with me in the studio of course Mike Robinson. We're joined today by Alex Thomson with Eastern Approaches, and of course Alex reporting from the Netherlands, and we're also joined by David Scott with Northern Exposure. David reporting on matters including matters north of the border. But the good news is the deal is done, Mike.
The deal is done. Here we go. Theresa May flew to Brussels at 7:30 this morning, apparently, to do the dirty deal. And don't they all look smug? Well, let's see what happened. She said, "We've been working extremely hard this week, and as you've all seen, it hasn't been easy for either side. What we've arrived at today represents a significant improvement." I'm not clear that she actually was aware of what it was a significant improvement over. But let's have a look at what Donald Tusk had to say, because this probably gives a little bit more insight than Theresa May. So here we go.
Good morning. This morning I received the confirmation from our negotiators that sufficient progress has been made. This allows me to present the draft guidelines for the December European Council, which I have just sent to the leaders. My proposals are the following. First, we should start negotiating the transition period so that people and businesses have clarity about the situation. As you know, the UK has asked for a transition of about 2 years while remaining part of the single market and customs union. And we'll be ready to discuss this, but naturally we have our conditions. I propose that during this period the UK will respect the whole of EU law, including new law. It will respect budgetary commitments. It will respect judicial oversight and, of course, all the related obligations. Clearly, within the transition period following the UK's withdrawal, EU decision-making will continue among the 27 member states without the UK.
So, Brian, the whole of EU law
And new law.
and new law. I think this is what we've been saying.
Well, so absolutely no change. There is no Brexit. We're locked in at law with the EU, and if they produce new law, we're locked into that new law as well.
So at this point, he's saying this is for the transition period of about 2 years, but we're not exactly sure how long the transition period is going to be, because that hasn't actually been negotiated yet. We haven't started that negotiation. That's going to start now. So will it be 2 years? Will it be 5 years? Will
2
it be
years
10 years?
negotiation about how long the negotiation period will take.
Well, no, apparently they claim that it's going to be a 1 year negotiation, because we've still got this deadline of March 2019 that we're actually leaving on. But then we've got to work out how long the transition period is going to be. Let's move on with.
Second, we want to begin discussions with the UK in order to explore the British vision of its future relationship with the EU. So far, we have heard a number of various ideas. We need more clarity on how the UK sees our future relations after it has left the single market and customs union. I therefore propose to mandate our negotiator to start exploratory talks with our British friends about this problem. On our side, we are ready to start preparing a close EU-UK partnership in trade, but also in the fight against terrorism and international crime, as well as security, defense, and foreign policy.
So what we've got now is a close UK-EU partnership, Brian, in the areas of trade, Europol, which is effectively what he's saying there, and also military union. These are the three key areas that we've been saying are the three areas which would make any idea of Brexit a nonsense, because if we opt into those, then there are terms and conditions that come with those, and those terms and conditions would have to be reflected in UK law. So what has been agreed? Well, here is the document, and let's have a look at the key paragraph here. It says, the United Kingdom remains committed to protecting North-South cooperation. This is all to do with the Northern Irish border. Any future arrangements must be compatible with these overarching requirements. The United Kingdom's intention is to achieve these objectives through the overall EU-UK relationship. Should this not be possible, the United Kingdom will propose specific solutions to address the unique circumstances of the island of Ireland. In the absence of agreed solutions, the United Kingdom will maintain full alignment with the rules of the internal market and the customs union, which now or in the future support North-South cooperation. So both parties have reached an agreement in principle across protecting the rights of union citizens, European Union citizens in the UK and UK citizens in the Union. So we've got free movement of people still. We've got a framework for addressing the unique circumstances of Northern Ireland, which is on the screen at the moment. And we've got the financial settlement, which at this point is not made public, so it's undefined. It goes on to say, following this paragraph, in the absence of agreed solutions, as set out in the previous paragraph, the United Kingdom will ensure that no new regulatory barriers develop between Northern Ireland and the rest of the United Kingdom. So it is actually just as we've suggested. The Northern Ireland border has been used as an excuse to create a new partnership, a customs partnership. And what the DUP managed to do by putting the kibosh on the previous agreement, because I believe that what Theresa May wanted to do was she was hoping to be able to sell the idea that Britain would be fully out of the single market and the customs union with special rules for Northern Ireland, which would allow some kind of PR fudge to get through this business of whether or not there would be free movement of people and so on. But what's been agreed now is that the rules that apply to Northern Ireland actually have to apply to the whole of the UK. And what's also been agreed is that the European Court of Justice is going to have jurisdiction over all this for at least 8 years, Brian.
Yeah.
For at least 8 years.
So we adhere to the European laws that exist, we adhere to the new laws, we adhere to the customs union, we adhere to the European security policy, we adhere to EU military unification. We are in the EU, we're staying in the EU, and it's obvious to see.
Absolutely. So who's responsible for this? Let's ask Donald Tusk again.
While being satisfied with today's agreement, which is obviously the personal success of Prime Minister Theresa May, let us remember that the most difficult challenge is still ahead. So
Theresa May has to take personal responsibility for this. He says it's her personal success. It's fantastic. Yeah. So the European Council, at least, and the EU, absolutely supporting her in her position. They don't want her removed, it seems.
No, Theresa May is the name, Mike. It's treason. We're watching treason.
So it's probably not a surprise then that when David Davis was interviewed by Hilary Benn at the Select Committee a couple of days ago, that he said this.
So the government hasn't undertaken any impact assessments on the implications for leaving the EU for different sectors of the British economy. So there isn't one, for example, on the automotive sector.
On the
automotive sector?
No, not I'm aware of, no.
Is there one on aerospace?
Not I'm aware of, no.
No. One on financial services?
Well, I think the answer is going to be no to all of them.
No to all of them, right. Now, doesn't it strike you, Secretary of State, as rather strange, given experience around the committee in which you have, the government undertakes impact assessments on all sorts of things all of the time, that on the most fundamental change that we are facing as a country, you've just told us that the government hasn't undertaken any impact assessments at all.
So it's really only a surprise that the government hasn't carried out any impact assessments at all, if the government is fully aware that there's no requirement to have impact assessments, because actually the situation isn't going to change significantly at all.
Well, you could come on that angle, Mike. The other thing you could say is, well, of course they couldn't do any impact assessments, because if you do an impact assessment, you actually have to be very specific in saying what the change is, what the status quo at the moment is, what the changes are you're proposing. So the deeper the impact assessment, the more the public's going to be able to see what the scam is. They couldn't do it, in my opinion, because it would show the public the whole thing is a complete scam. There is no Brexit.
Let's bring Alex Thomson in first. Alex, what are your thoughts on this?
I think everything you've just outlined, Mike, is a kind of sweet spot between all the rivals and enemies of the British people's sovereign vote to leave Brexit. And I'll go from west to east. You've got the Irish Republic, with an extremely corrupt Dublin government, with Mr Varadkar recently having to sack his deputy, or rather the deputy's party getting rid of her by making her resign. Mrs Fitzgerald, who was very involved in the Doherty issue. So the Justice Ministry in Dublin in particular completely corrupt and controlled, all the Gardaí scandals. And as my Irish sources tell me, this has been kept a lid on by waving the green flag. All the parties, including Sinn Féin, who were bought out by Soros and not at all nationalists, just like SNP in Scotland, they like to point the finger at Westminster, this is famous Irish and Scottish catchphrase, Westminster, the root of all evil. So that's one of the aspects. Then you've got the delicate situation in Northern Ireland, where we're overblown with the idea that without the EU, the Good Friday Agreement of nearly 20 years ago is going to unravel. At the root of that, you have this new identity where people of the younger generation, Protestant and Catholic, say that they have a Northern Irish identity, which is neither Irish nor British when it comes down to it. And this kind of fudges that. And as you say, Mike, Mrs May tried to woo those initially by saying, do you want the customs border to be in the North Sea? Likewise, the nationalists in Scotland and Wales have similar points. The civil service, the Sir Humphreys, have always wanted shot of Northern Ireland. So they, like the EU's protestations of love for the Republic, so the civil service's protestations of undying love for Ulster is complete tosh, as anyone with an eye open during the Troubles. And Sir Paddy Mayhew's statement will know that Her Majesty's government has no selfish interest in Northern Ireland, and John Major and Blair saying, within my lifetime, it'll probably go to the Republic. So, and then finally the continent, where there's this vague perception that Ireland wants to stay in Europe, as they call it. But David will speak about this more later, the Irish aspects of it. But the continent have completely misunderstood the nature of Irish politics and the fact that there have to be clients above the ruling layer in Ireland. So it's a meeting of all the enemies that Britain has always, or British sovereignty has always had, but it could easily have been fought back against if we had people of any knowledge in the Westminster government, any knowledge of Scotland and Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland. Even knowledge of the English people seems to be lacking now among Tory politicians and some of the Labour Brexiteers. That is really the collapse of confidence which has allowed this fast one to be pulled on us.
David, have you any thoughts on this?
I'd like to make just 3 quick points. I was absolutely blown away by that speech that you've played there. The 2-year transition agreement, whereby we'll have to pay our full financial contribution, be governed by the laws set in Europe, have no influence in deciding those laws, and be bound by their courts as well. That's called being a colony. So the transition agreement is for us to spend 2 years or more as a colony of the EU.
Well, just sorry, David, can I just come in on that one? Because what I think that's about, I mean, you can correct me if you think I'm wrong, but what I think that's about is because the European Union doesn't actually want Britain to leave. That what they want to do is to put Britain, well, they not just drag it out, but they want to create a furore. They want to create some momentum in the Remain campaign, because what you've just said is going to be for some people is going to be pretty hard to take. I think for Leavers it's going to be hard to take, but so they're attempting to build some kind of dynamic to stay within the EU, within Britain.
Certainly. Second point, the agreement that if there's no agreement, in other words, if the EU says no, then essentially the Northern Ireland's going to remain in the EU in all practical terms. right? That's an obvious assault on sovereignty. And the third one, which you mentioned briefly, you said the EU court would have 8 years further jurisdiction.
That's how it's been reported, yes.
That takes us up to 2025. We'll come to that date shortly.
Well, we will indeed. Brian.
Well, I've got to hand over to Alex here. I think this is the German elections.
Right. Sorry, Alex. German elections.
Yes, so if we just keep that on screen for 10 seconds worth, what this is about with the 8 years of jurisdiction is that Luxembourg, the European Court, is going to have jurisdiction over people in Britain, these whipped up supporters of European Union continuity who've been told you have no future. And today some of my friends are saying they're crying tears of joy because the EU stood up for them. These people are going to be told that their jurisdiction is split. They no longer owe loyalty to Her Majesty's government, although they remain in Britain. And even if they're on the way to British citizenship, they're going to be told the ECJ has jurisdiction over you that's personal. So that's a reversal of nation statehood and a return to medieval feudalism where courts have jurisdiction over people, not over territory. So it's an undoing of the rule of law is what's going on there. Now, as for the German elections, I'm just highlighting here that the Alternative für Deutschland party has been putting momentum into this for some time. They've won just shy of 100 seats in the Bundestag now in the elections of a few weeks ago. And here the joint leaders, there's Alice Weidel on the left and Alexander Gauland on the right, have both used the same word, which has very strong connotations in German, gescheitert, which means grandly fails. Merkel used the same word herself in admitting that her refugee policy had grandiose gescheitert, failed something rotten. And so both of these leaders of the Alternative für Deutschland have said that Merkel's leadership has now gescheitert. And what I put in the bottom corner of that slide was a reminder that Thorsten Schulte, the advisor on currencies, who left Merkel's party to become a dissident on this, the Silberjunge is his nickname, he had also used this same argument that we have to target Merkel personally. That is coming to fruition, and that is the route. And this has been acknowledged by the Secretary of State from the US now, Mr. Tillerson, while he was in Brussels for the NATO thing recently. He said Germany's in a very difficult position. Well, that's the root of it. The German nationalists and patriots, not just the AfD, but others as well, the CDU people as well, have realized they have to get rid of Merkel. And that is what's given Mr. Schulz, the socialist leader, the absolute federalist, the chance to join in with these nationalists and say Merkel has to go. And from his point of view, the EU project has to be sped up. David will talk about that more later. So Schulz has chosen his chance, and German post-war politics really has been wrecked now, gescheitert, as the Germans say.
Well, that's quite interesting because I understand that the Germans have suddenly twigged that the European Commission is attempting to create an EU treasury. And this is, in fact, feeding into this narrative and giving AfD a bit of momentum.
Yes, Germans are the ultimate slow boil nation. There are other Germanic nations in Europe, including the English and Scots, and they are famous for the same thing, which is lots of patience and then suddenly snapping and making an end of their annoyances. And the Germans are 10 times more patient and then aggressive. We're going to be covering this in future weeks, German realization of the fast one, which has been pulled on them by the EU and the US and the Allies generally. Citizenship and statehood in Germany are huge elements of debate. And over the next few weeks, we do intend to be covering that very thoroughly, because this is going to be the time when the German mass awakening happens. And that's it, really. That's another reason why Schulz, who is, by German terms, even an extremely socialistic international character, even though lots of Germans are that way, he's having to run ahead now because the window is closing for him to be able to stitch this all up.
OK, now in the Netherlands then, of course, referenda, quite common in the Netherlands, but apparently there's not going to be a referendum on the referenda.
No, Peter Hitchens, talking to RTE in Dublin the other day, said, well, you in the Irish Republic have a constitutional provision for referenda and you do them properly and they're binding. But he said, I don't believe that they're the right way for a Britain to have gone. And he was right. He's been borne out in that. Brexit has been messed up because of this referendum approach. But the Dutch have a similar statute-based and retractable idea of a consultative referendum. But because this went the wrong way a couple of times, particularly over the EU-Ukraine Association Agreement, Mrs. Ollongren, the new Liberal Home Secretary in the Netherlands, has said there that actually we would, in theory, have to have a referendum about the abolition of this statute because that's the current statutory framework. But she says the rules apply as long as the rules are there. And when we cancel the rules no longer apply. And I never liked it anyway.
Yes.
So there you have it.
Okay. Now, moving quickly on, David, 23 nations signed up for PESCO a few weeks ago, and Ireland was not one of them. But it seems that decision has now been reversed, and in fact it was reversed yesterday. And I do wonder whether this is a coincidence that this decision to join took place yesterday, and Theresa May able to announce a new agreement on Brexit today. But tell us a bit about this.
Well, the Dáil passed it, 75 votes to 42. Both Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael voted for this. And the Irish journal here says the plan has raised concerns that it could undermine Ireland's policy of neutrality. It might be the first step towards an EU army. Now, let us remember what PESCO is all about. The article we covered a couple of weeks ago was discussing the political underpinnings of it. It said the political aim of PESCO should always be kept in mind, ensuring Europe's autonomy to be able to intervene independently in its neighbourhood whenever important values or interests are at stake. So it's all about collective action. It's all about collective action out with the borders of the EU to impose their will. And that's what Ireland signed up to.
Yeah, indeed.
Okay, well, let's get to the heart of the matter, and that's EU military unification. We're going to say that we're extremely pleased that our submission to the Defence Committee, led by David Ellis, but Alex, you've also had input. I've had a little bit of input. This document has finally got through, because I understand that initially the secretaries of the Defence Committee were a little bit confused as to whether they'd received it or not, although they had in fact signed for it. So if you haven't seen that paper yet, this is the header for it, and it is available on the UK Column website. Tell us a bit more about this, and then we'll have a look at a little bit of the detail in diagram form.
It's something that must be read from beginning to end. It's on the front page of the website and should be shared liberally. This is exactly what was sent to the committee by recorded delivery a Monday week ago. And by the end of that week, they were telling David Ellis, the clerks of the committee, that they could neither confirm nor deny receipt of it. But Dr. Lewis was out of the office that day. Now I think David Ellis has, well, he's always very good at making his calculations. He's decided now is the time to go public. So we've put the text of this out. Now we know that the committee's received it. Whether they wish to admit it into their documentation or not is another matter. The public needs to know this as well, and we have named the individuals involved there as well, particularly the FCO Director, Angus Lapsley, and the MOD Director, Dr. Brian Wells, of shady past, to say the least, who is double-hatted. He's MOD, and he's also a director appointed by Mrs. Mogherini 2 years ago of the European Defence Agency. And these are the Sir Humphreys who have been stymieing Brexit in defence, and particularly defence procurement in the case of Dr. Wells at the MOD.
Now, as a result of all that and everything that's going on, Brian, today we have a tweet going out from the First Sea Lord saying, today I was able, that would be yesterday, I was able to thank my French counterpart, Admiral Christophe Prazouk, for the support the Marine Nationale has given Royal Navy as we regenerate our carrier skills. With the arrival of HMS Queen Elizabeth, a new era of UK-French carrier cooperation awaits.
Yeah, well, this is just disgraceful, and the First Sea Lord should be ashamed of himself. We've had to go grovelling to the French because, of course, the British government scrapped our existing aircraft carriers. Not only did we lose the ships, of course, we lost the expertise of the men and women who were on board those ships, the training and the ability to operate aircraft. So we've had those British service personnel from the Royal Navy have had to go on board French aircraft carriers, supposedly to learn their trade. I just find it, I think I'll stop there because I'm likely to say a word that I'm not allowed to use on UK Column. But Admiral Philip Jones should be ashamed of himself. And of course, it was his colleagues who had meetings with the French where they decided that this scam was going to be put together, and they did it in plain clothes. They did not wear their uniforms, they wore lounge suits, and in fact, in my personal opinion, this was treason behind closed doors at the British ambassador's residence in Paris. So let's have a look at how the machinery works, and the submission to the Defence Committee outlines this. I'm going to hand over to Alex just after I've run through the main points here, but the organisation we're looking at is the Defence Suppliers Forum, DSF. This is linked into the International Strategy Forum, ISF. And what's all this about? Well, this is a closed group with membership by the official defence, with membership, I should say, of the official Defence Suppliers Forum arrangements. And ISF's membership is selected by the Secretary of State for Defence. So this is a very circular little plot, as we see already. So what can we say? Well, the International Strategy Forum, co-chaired by Dr. Brian Wells, Mod Director of Science and Technology, also tied into the Director of European Defence Agency. So here's the European angle. We come off in the other direction, give you a bit more detail about the connections through to the sorry, I beg your pardon there, the ADS organisation, and that's the premier trade organisation for companies in the UK, aerospace, defence, security and space sectors. And the connection is that ISF is a group member of ADS, and ADS then has a policy group, if I can pop that on, which provides advice to the ICF and ADS. Now, if you think this is complex, in my opinion, it's designed to be to confuse the public and to stop you seeing what's happening. But in the top left-hand corner, we're going to introduce the Norway model. This is where the Norwegians have been caught up in this system, and we can see that we are now also being forced in this direction. So we've got the EU Common Security and Defence Policy, CSDP, we've got the EU Defence Procurement Arrangements, we've got the EU Agreements, SDIP, EDAP, and we've got the European Defence Fund. But let's put the icing on the cake. Who's connected back into this? None other than Juncker's via his private office. Alex, this is, what do we describe? This is subversion, in my opinion. Our national institutions have been infiltrated and taken over by a foreign power, the European Union.
Yes, and if we just keep that slide on a moment because of the complexity of it, that last arrow you put in, Juncker's private office, we must stress, and we do so in the text of the submission, that is the only one we don't have documentation for, so we're suggesting very strongly that's the case. The rest is confirmed by David making his phone calls. Now, just with this on screen, the point is the DSF, and it's particularly the subgroup, the ISF, is supposedly defence industry advising the Secretary of State for Defence, so now Gavin Williamson, but through most of this, of course, it was Mr. Nurseries. They advise on what they are prepared to accept and what they wish to see for the future of British defence industry, which of course guarantees the future of our military and our sovereignty. But the trouble is that this board has been stuffed with these people from the top right, the ADS, the trade organisation with the dodgy website. And when David Ellis did his phone calls, he got particularly through to a lady called Kellyanne Conway, who said, oh, yes, I tell the DSF what line to take and how to advise the Secretary of State for Defence on what to accept in defence integration and the defence future, industrial defence future. Trouble is, Kellyanne Conway's last job was head of international relations for the Labour Party. The other chap David Ellis spoke to there, Mr. Sinclair, was previously advisor to a front bencher for Labour who was completely in favour of defence industry integration with Europe. So you see what's going on there. And at the highest level of it on the MOD side, because the FCO has its own closed loop with Angus Lapsley, who only came in mid-career into the FCO. He's really a Tony Blair loyalist. The MOD side with Dr. Brian Wells, who, by the way, was Kelly's boss at the time of Dr. David Kelly's death. You can read a lot about that. Dr. Brian Wells has these underlings who came across straight from the Labour Party in order to advise him on what to say in this closed loop. No membership can be, no public availability of membership to any old defence industry. It has to be the right people. They tell the Secretary of State what to do. So this loop closes us into the Norway model, just as we were talking a few minutes ago, with effectively the Norway or the membership of the European Economic Area, the EEA, being a predetermined outcome, the Norway option again, in the customs and single market terms, particularly customs, because Norway has got a pro-EU government and an anti-EU population like Britain, particularly England, and this is the stitch-up they've done there. And I've had sources telling me that the same thing is going on on the civilian and customs channels. The Norway option is the predetermined conclusion. That is what has been stitched up for us. At the end of this, we're going to be in the customs union and not going to be able to trade on our own terms with the rest of the world.
Yeah. Well, you tweeted this out earlier, and these are the two that you've been talking about, Angus Lapsley on the left and Dr. Brian Wells on the right.
Yeah, these are the men, and they need a lot of pressure on them now. I've got my old civil service people, most of them have shunned me now, starting with unfriending me on Facebook, but never mind. That whole generation has absolutely blinkered views, and they just want their pensions, I'm afraid. These guys need hammering, politely and democratically, and to be asked repeatedly where their loyalties and particularly their expertise comes from. It's bad enough to have learned your skills in Mr. Lapsley's case at the knee of Mrs. Mogherini's service with no prior defence and security expertise, but that's bad enough. But then, where's your expertise coming from, and where are your loyalties? And if you tie those two together, really, you're a very dangerous individual and not fit to be a top-ranking civil servant.
Alex, thank you. And for our viewers, if you want to research into this, and we encourage you to do that, here's ADS's website. You can read about ADS and what they say about themselves. You can also get into the Defence Suppliers Forum through the government's website and have a look at the list of names and companies involved. As I've said here, it's hard to tell whether you're dealing with government or the civil service or big business. This is something extraordinary unfolding here. Britain as a nation state is being taken apart.
And in the meantime, the drive for United States of Europe continues. And Martin Schulz tweeted out yesterday, I think, I want a new constitutional treaty to establish the United States of Europe, a Europe that is no threat to its member states, but a beneficial addition. And that was followed up with a tweet saying a convention to draft this treaty in close cooperation with civil society and the people. Its results will then be submitted to all member states. Any states that won't ratify this treaty will automatically leave the EU.
So there you have it. The United States of Europe is coming. It's coming by 2025. That was the date he chose. And it's going to be worked out by a constitutional convention that they'll set up to discuss it with civil society, bypassing national governments, who will then be offered a take it or leave it deal with expulsion from the EU as a penalty for saying no. So that's, well, it's certainly much clearer. It wasn't much clearer on the BBC. The BBC reported this simply as Martin Schulz making a speech in which he agreed to negotiate with Merkel about forming a new government. You know, they never mentioned United States of Europe once. Isn't that remarkable? A Telegraph did, and I thought this was really one of the most wonderful paragraphs I've ever read in a Telegraph. They quote Martin Schulz, I want a new constitutional treaty to establish the United States of Europe, a Europe that is no threat to its member states, but a beneficial addition. And they then comment under Mr. Schulz's proposal, Brussels would be given power over individual member states' foreign and domestic policy, as well as taxes. So that's no threat, is it?
No, it all. No, it isn't. Right. What else do we need to be fully locked into the European Union? Well, it's armed police. Those armed police are coming. David, you've been talking about what's been happening in this respect north of the border, but here we are. We've got the scam that we now need to arm rural police forces because they can't get the armed response teams to any location fast enough in view of this horrific terrorist threat. So the armed police coming in, no debate in Parliament. They need the armed police because that is the routine in Europe. And what sort of country is Britain? Well, we just mentioned Boris because Mike has been leading a search party for Boris Johnson. We now know that he's on his way to Iran. He's there to help the lady journalist who's been locked up. And I just wanted to put Melanie Shaw alongside. Boris Johnson can travel to Iran because a journalist has been locked up. but absolute no interest from the Conservative government to a child abuse whistleblower who's been locked up in prison and abused in Britain. So can we expect the BBC to report? Yesterday, we took the lid off the BBC's media collaboration network and pointed out that the BBC was going to be paying the salaries of, for example, Trinity Mirror journalists to report on democracy. We felt a lot safer, didn't we, Mike, on hearing that? And it's reality, because here we have Cornwall Live boasting that it's now using the BBC in pioneering work to report democracy. And there in the photo are a group of people being told what is going to happen, whether they like it or not. And of course, that's reported as democracy.
Well, okay. Someone who is not ever going to appear on the BBC is Vanessa Beeley. So a bit of an advertisement here. She is going to be on Going Underground tomorrow on RT. It's going to be broadcast, I think, 3 or 4 times during the day, so it's on various times. Do watch that if you get a chance, because Vanessa will be going into the funding of the use of taxpayers' money to support Al-Qaeda related organisations in some detail, and she'll be producing some information that hasn't been seen before. Brian, so
well done, Vanessa.
Yes,
well done, Vanessa.
Yes. Right now, Alex, we've got to run through this very quickly. First of all, we got Mikhail Saakashvili. Was he arrested in Ukraine or was he not? I wasn't quite sure at the end of the day, but the headline in the Independent here is former president of Georgia threatens to jump off roof as Poroshenko-backed prosecutors circle. But in Poland as well, we have stuff going on, because Beata Szydło, who was the Prime Minister, has been displaced. And it looks like we're getting an ex-banker in Poland to replace her.
Yes. Now, if you put these two together, you could say that Misha, a very important hitman for the neocons in the Eastern European context, is perhaps being set up, to be returned to Poland and possibly even made useful there, because ultimately the neocons are in league with bankers there. Beata Szydło has resisted the migration quota particularly well, perhaps too well for Western Europe's liking, and so Saakashvili seems to have gone free again. But even if he is extradited, if the successor is in place, then we could expect perhaps Saakashvili to be quietly exfiltrated somewhere else again. I mean, stateless and threatening to hurl himself off a roof, it's quite an undignified end for a man who 9 years ago thought he was George Soros's front man for war against Russia, and of course failed in that aim as well.
Yes, but doesn't this maybe say something about how Soros treats his goons?
Yes. He chews them up and spits them out, and that applies very much to his Hollywood and his other cronies. Sinn Féin, for example, I don't have much evidence of SNP funding from Soros, but all of these fake nationalists, they're certainly the memes they use come from Soros, and in the end, of course, they get chewed up and spat out. Yeah.
Okay, let's come back to the UK then, and David, the child sexual abuse inquiry, and you wanted to highlight this organisation, Shatter Boys UK.
Yes, I've been following this on Twitter, and I had assumed it was simply one of many groups of victims and survivors standing up and speaking up for those who have been abused. But some concerning issues came to light, and it is important that as we fight for justice for victims and survivors, we make sure that we maintain the right standards of integrity. And I think there are one or two significant questions for this organisation to ask. It was founded, as you see here, by 2 people. Now it's Daniel Wollstonecraft. Daniel Wollstonecraft is a gentleman on the left-hand side of that photograph, and Dave Norman is on the right. Now Dave Norman is no longer part of the organisation. It was founded in 2016, but he doesn't seem to be associated with it anymore, and several other directors have resigned. But Daniel Wollstonecraft, he's been rather fated. He's now part of the official inquiry, the official government inquiry into child sexual abuse. He's part of the Victims and Survivors Consultative Group, which is around 6 or 7 people drawn from across the UK. So he's got a very high profile, and although the organisation is very new, he's gone right to the very top of the tree in this area. Now, one of the researchers working in Scotland on this subject, when looking into this, found very strangely that the Companies House records are actually different. They don't have the name as Daniel Wollstonecraft, but as Daniel Wollstone
Right. Well, look,
Home.
we will show that here, because here's the Companies House record for Shatter Boys UK Limited, and if we scroll down to that point, we can see that. Well, I mean, you have established that the address is the same, but the name is different. Yes. So
the name is different.
How can Daniel have a different name on Companies House and a different name when he's representing child sexual abuse survivors at the independent inquiry?
Well, this is the question. We've asked this question, we haven't had an answer. We've had several answers, but no justification. It was claimed to be a spelling mistake, and then it was claimed to be a spelling mistake by a lawyer, and then it was claimed to be a spelling mistake by the lawyer's typist. But there's nothing being provided to substantiate this, and it seems extremely strange, because I know from personal experience, when setting up a company with Companies House, identity is everything. You have to provide passports, you have to provide all sorts of information to make sure you are who you claim to be. It's very, very strange, and we really need an answer as to what what the explanation is.
I mean, is there anything to suggest anything major underhand here going on?
Well, we're getting feedback from victims and survivors in Manchester that's shall we say, disturbing, about the way that this organisation is behaving, how it's treating people, the amount of dispute that's being created, and the reaction from some of the people who used to be part of the organisation. Money's being collected. It's a very new organisation with no accounts being produced yet. There are just a great many questions about this. There was a fraud case with the same name. We don't know if it's the same person. There was a well-known fraud case, Daniel Wollstonecraft versus Mohammed Nazim, in which Daniel Wollstonecraft was found by the court to be operating in a fraudulent manner and trying to claim money that he wasn't entitled to, and via dishonesty. Whether that's the same Daniel Wollstonecraft, we don't know. But why the different name, we don't know. Why the nature of the people leaving the organisation. We would like to get some answers. If anyone out there knows more about this, I would hope we get in touch and let us have the information.
Okay, now let's move on to Scotland just briefly. A blow for the SNP as the named person plan is delayed once again. You seem the no to named person scheme seems to be doing pretty well at the moment, David.
Oh yes, they're having to get used to winning. This is very strange for any organisation that's taking on the state, because it's such an unequal fight. But what's happened here is the politicians have eventually got on board. The opposition politicians, for assorted reasons, not necessarily ones of great principle, have decided to vote against the latest patch of the government scheme to steal everyone's information and surveil the entire nation. And they've not passed this bill through a committee stage. This has never happened before in the Scottish Parliament. Completely unprecedented. No one really knows what to do. But it would appear that until they get more information, there is a full explanation as to how the scheme's going to work via a code of practice, which won't be ready until late 2018 at the earliest, that the whole thing is stuck. So again, this is a 2014 Act originally. We still wait, and there's more delay, but it's it's positive that the legislation is not being put in force, because it will further undermine the rights of people in Scotland. But you have to remember that the actual data sharing is going on all the time illegally, so that's a separate fight. Now, just a little comment on how much all of this is costing. The government, having lost so badly, had to pay not only their own legal bill, but the legal bill of the No to Name Person campaign. So that's £800,000 of taxpayers' money down the giant memory hole. And that's a small amount compared to the overall cost of this scheme so far, which is, I understand, sitting around 60 million. 60 million squandered, not on looking after children, but on trying to introduce a surveillance state.
Is the third sector becoming an arm of the state?
This is a another article by my good lady wife, who is looking at a Scottish, I think, called the Scottish Government National Third Sector GERFEC project. Now, she comments here that the charities and organisations involved in this project have been revealed to parents as purveyors and enforcers of state agenda and dogma, rather than autonomous ports of objective assistance and support. And she comments that the third sector needs to remember its roots and its purpose, break away from its dangerous liaison with government, and turn its focus once more to providing independent, objective advice and support to families. If not, then the future of the third sector will be assimilation by government and shunning by the people they claim to serve. I thought she put that rather well.
Indeed. Are we going to end on Peter Cherby?
I think we just need to cover this and do this one.
Okay, so we'll do this one. So Peter Cherby here, Diary of Injustice in Scotland, if you want to find the blog. And the headline is Cry Wolffe, Judicial Office hit with new conflict of interest claims as Court of Session papers reveal £9 million damages claim against the Chief Constable and Lord Advocate. James Wolffe QC was set to be heard by the Lord Advocate's wife, Judge Lady Wolffe. Wow.
Wow, wow indeed. And you know, when it was then subsequently changed to someone else and someone pointed out that you really can't do that, there was still no record of the recusal against her name, which is strange. Now, Peter Kirby put forward a petition to have a register of judicial interest in Scotland 5 years ago. And after 5 years of fighting and trying to keep this petition alive, he's now getting some support. Alex Neil, MSP, tweeted out yesterday, it is now time for the Petitions Committee itself to look at the powers of parliamentary committees to introduce a bill to set up a judicial register of interests. So well done, Peter Kirby. Without you, the fight against injustice in Scotland would be a much bleaker thing.
David, thank you very much for that. And on the subject of named person, there was quite a lot of more material from the national press and media that we had available because Nicola Sturgeon is clearly under attack over it. There's the expenditure of it. There's now members of the Scottish Parliament involved. This absolutely shows what people can do when they come together to run a campaign and they do it in the right way. They get in amongst the political organisations, they challenge people on the ground, and look what's happened. The named person scheme would have been enforced now, in my opinion, without question, had it not been for the good work of the people who've come together. What do you think, very quickly, what do you think has made the No to the Named Person campaign so effective?
It was very broadly based. It was not ideological in any narrow political sense. It focused very much on the wrongs of the act. And they agreed on one thing and brought people from all across the nation, all sorts of different views, right across the political spectrum and every other sort of spectrum together, and focused clearly and consistently on one achievable objective.
Yeah. Excellent. And of course, if that can happen north of the border, it can happen elsewhere. So just think about that. If you want to stop what's happening, then come together and start to work on that broad sort of front. That brings us to the end of today's UK column news. I'll just say that due to personal commitments, I may not be back before we break for the Christmas period. So if that is the case, I will see you personally in the new year, or at least I'll be on the video screen. But thank you very much to all the people who've responded to my request for financial support for the UK column. We're still getting donations in and subscriptions, so thank you very much indeed for that. But the team will be back on Monday at 1 o'clock. Thank you. Bye-bye.